we look at the American Civil War as this 4-year-long, really bloody conflict that claims the lives of over 720,000 people, at least. And at the time, though, in April of 1861, they didn't know that. They thought this was going to be a short and glorious and bloodless war. We all know that's not the case. But left and right, you have guys, overtaken with patriotic war fever, joining different regiments in Western Pennsylvania in particular. But as we're talking about USCT troops, or eventually leading to that, there are numbers from the African American population in Pittsburgh that wanted to enlist. And this actually, what I pulled up here, what you're seeing, is an excerpt from the Pittsburgh Gazette on April 18th, 1861. So not long after the war starts. And this is actually from a company, about roughly 100 guys, called the Hannibal Guards. This is a small company that was actually a pre-war unit. It started in 1855 by a guy named William Sirwell, who during the Civil War is going to be commanding the 78th Pennsylvania Infantry. Sirwell in 55 raises this company of African American troops, and this isn't super uncommon. There's towns and cities across the North that have these small militia units of African American soldiers, kind of in response to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. You have slave catchers from the South coming up into northern states and basically trying to make money taking people who the law considered property back into southern towns. And so as a result, you have some of these militia units that are brought up. The Hannibal Guards is one of them. And so at the start of the American Civil War, the Hannibal Guards, just like any other good Northerner, are trying to join the ranks of the Union Army. And so this correspondence was actually sent to James Negley, who's pretty well known in the Western theater of the war later on. And this is sent on April 17th by the company's captain, Sam Sanders. He says, "As we sympathize with our white fellow citizens at the present crisis, and to show that we can and do feel interested in the present state of affairs, and as we consider ourselves American citizens and interested in the commonwealth of all our white fellow citizens, although deprived of all political rights, we yet wish the government of the United States to be sustained against the tyranny of slavery, and are willing to assist in any honorable way or manner to sustain the present administration. We therefore tender to the state the services of the Hannibal Guards." And so, as I said, this is sent right after the war starts. Unfortunately, they are not accepted into service, and this is the case in many places where African Americans are offering their services to the United States Army, yet they're not permitted to serve, as they are not seen as equal with their white counterparts. And this is kind of how it's going to be for the first half of the American Civil War. These guys weren't going to be permitted to join the military really until 1862 in some fashion. In the summer of 1862, Abraham Lincoln is actually going to permit some African Americans in some capacity to join the Federal Army. And really, that's, the result of this is the efforts of African Americans with, you could say, bigger names like Robert Smalls, who I have pictured right here. For those who don't know, I'm not actually in Pittsburgh. I'm in Beaufort County, South Carolina, where the weather is a little bit warmer. I'm sorry to rub it in, but I hear it's been nice this past week. But anyway, I'm about an hour and 20 minutes south of Charleston Harbor. And we just discussed Charleston Harbor. This is where the Civil War is really going to kick off here in the state of South Carolina. But something that happens in May of 1862 is going to help kind of move along this effort to enlist African Americans in the U.S. military. A lot of this is done in part by this gentleman, Robert Smalls. Smalls was actually born here in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Smalls, he's born into slavery, and he'd been working in Charleston Harbor for a majority of his life. In May of 1862, Robert Smalls, long story short, is going to steal a Confederate ship called the CSS Planter. He steals it in the dark of night. He has a crew of 8 guys. He also has his family on board. And he does the miraculous. He steals this boat and gets it past several forts in the harbor, including Fort Sumter, under cover of darkness. Using his wits, he uses the Confederate codes that they had used to pass through the harbor in normal times, and he gets the ship into the Union naval blockade in Charleston Harbor. And as a result, he's paid a sum of money for this ship. He ends up piloting the same ship for the Union Navy for some time afterward. But he also goes on these kind of recruiting campaigns. He starts to bolster interest in getting African Americans into the U.S. Navy and the Army, and basically proves that they are as worthy of being in the military as any white soldier. And so his name, is synonymous with freedom and the fighting African American in the American Civil War, and he's a national celebrity. Kind of relating this story to Pittsburgh, for example, about a year later, after he takes the Planter in Charleston Harbor, as Robert E. Lee is preparing to invade Pennsylvania, the city of Pittsburgh are going to defend themselves by erecting 37 earthen forts around the city. Now, not many of them remain today, but one of them was built solely by the African American community of Pittsburgh in what is now the Arlington Heights neighborhood, or what was back then McGuire's Hill. And it was about 250 men who labored on this fort. And when it was all said and done, when it was finished, by the end of June of 1863, they dubbed it Fort Robert Smalls. And it actually had remained intact until about the 1930s. But it kind of shows what he meant to the African American community, and he also inspired a lot of African Americans to eventually enlist. Somebody else, and probably someone that people might be more familiar with, is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is, he had already lived a life of slavery in Maryland. He was an outspoken civil rights leader in the mid-19th century, and like others, he also championed to have African Americans enlist in the U.S. Army as well. And this is something he promoted for quite a while. And something I want to point out real quick here, Douglass actually spoke in Pittsburgh in the summer of 1863. And this is at Lafayette Hall, which would have been the cross-section of Wood Street and 4th, downtown Pittsburgh. Another one that people might be familiar with is Martin Delany. If you were to go to PPG Place in downtown Pittsburgh, you'll actually see a Pennsylvania Historical Commission sign for Martin Delany. Delany, he was actually born in Charlestown, Virginia, or what is now West Virginia. And Delany was born to a mother who's free, and his father was enslaved. So naturally, being from a mother who is free, Delany was considered free at birth. And the family goes to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And eventually, at the age of 19, Delany makes his way to Pittsburgh to pursue a medical career. And so Delany, even 20 years before the American Civil War, is publishing a newspaper called The Mystery. And it's the first African-American newspaper of its kind, completely run and edited by an African-American west of the Allegheny Mountains. He teams up with Frederick Douglass in the pre-war period, kind of promoting this idea of abolitionism way before the Civil War. And during the Civil War, Delany, kind of like Douglass, is going to be championing for African-American service. He's going to be touring around the United States and recruiting African-American troops once they're able to do so. And actually, Delany, you can see in this photograph here, this photo is taken early to mid 1865, so toward the end of the Civil War, if not after. And Delany is actually going to be the first officer commissioned as major. during the Civil War, the highest ranking African American during the Civil War. According to Delaney, he actually met with Abraham Lincoln in person in February of 1865. And he had this idea to recruit essentially an entire army of African Americans to cut through the heart of the American South, through the Confederacy, and liberate everyone that had been enslaved down there. And keep in mind, there's 4 million people enslaved in the South. And Lincoln basically thought it was a good idea to start with Delaney and promoting him to major. Delaney's actually going to be sent down here where I am in Beaufort County to the Department of the South. And he's going to be major for the 104th USCT, or 104th United States Colored Troops. And that's where he's going to be at the end of the war and following the war. Really what this all rides on, though, what Black service rides on, is going to be the Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln signs the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which essentially says that if Confederate states or states that are engaged in open rebellion do not lay down their arms by New Year's Day of 1863, then he's going to free all of the enslaved people. Now, there's some caveats to this. They're freeing the people in the South where this law can actually be exercised. So that means there has to be Union troops in the area to essentially enforce this law. This does not apply, unfortunately, to border states. So, it doesn't apply to Maryland or Kentucky, for example. But places, like where I am in Beaufort County, South Carolina, there's Union troops everywhere. So this is a place where they could enforce that law. And another part of this, though, is this is going to allow for African Americans to enlist in the United States military moving forward. And so 1863 is the big year. We're going to see a huge boost in African American enlistment. Now, before this, in 1862, from the summer onward, there were some units of African Americans that existed, but not all were necessarily recognized by the United States government. And that, for example, the 1st Kansas, you have Louisiana Native Guard, for example, and you also have one down here, the 1st South Carolina Infantry, that eventually is going to be the 33rd USCT. The Emancipation Proclamation and Emancipation Day moving forward is we're going to see a lot of African Americans enlisting in the United States military. As we kind of mentioned earlier, one that a lot of people are familiar with is the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, and they actually had a sister unit called the 55th Regiment Massachusetts Infantry. Like I said before, you might be familiar with with this unit in particular because of the movie Glory that came out quite a while ago. But the 54th Massachusetts, they start to recruit troops in early 1863, not too long after, after Lincoln releases the Emancipation Proclamation. And actually, quite a few guys from Pittsburgh are going to enlist in the 54th and 55th Massachusetts Infantry. Among those, you have 2 sons of Frederick Douglass that enlist. Martin Delaney's son is also going to enlist in the 54th Massachusetts. There are recruiting agents sent from Boston all the way to Pittsburgh to recruit these guys. Pittsburgh as a whole, Allegheny County as a whole, is going to supply roughly 160 African-American men for service in the United States Army. Those are guys that are residing in Allegheny County at the time. But there's at least 500 that are eventually going to live in Allegheny County that enlist elsewhere. Now, these guys, even though they're permitted to join the U.S. military, they're facing great odds. For example, and I couldn't memorize this, so I kind of have it right here next to me. As African American troops are being enlisted in the U.S. military, the Confederate government essentially says, if they were to capture African American regiments in battle, These guys could be killed on the spot. They could be, even if they are born free, they could be sent into slavery. And they even threatened to kill white officers. And so actually, Abraham Lincoln counters this in July of 1863 with General Order Number 252. He says, "It is the duty of every government to give protection to its citizens, of whatever class, color, or condition, and especially to those who are duly organized as soldiers in the public service. The law of nations and the usages and customs of war, as carried on by civilized powers, permit no distinction as to color in the treatment of prisoners of war, war as public enemies. To sell or enslave any captured person on account of his color and for no offense against the laws of war is a relapse into barbarism and a crime against the civilization of the age. The government of the United States will give the same protection to all its soldiers, and if the enemy shall sell or enslave anyone because of his color, the offense shall be punished by retaliation upon the enemy's prisoners in our possession. It is therefore ordered that for every soldier in the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed. And for everyone enslaved by the enemy or sold into slavery, a rebel soldier shall be placed at hard labor on the public works and continued at such labor until the other shall be released and receive the treatment due to a prisoner of war." And so that's kind of the stance that the United States government is initially going to take on the enlistment of black troops in the U.S. military. Real quick, I want to point out what you're looking at right here is a post-war print from Kurtz and Allison from 1890. It depicts the storming of Fort Wagner, which, you know, if you saw Glory, that is the climax of the movie, the very end of the movie. You can see right here troops of the 54th Massachusetts storming the ramparts of Fort Wagner on Morris Island outside of Charleston. And kind of toward the center of the picture, you can see young Robert Gould Shaw, the regiment's colonel, as he was killed on the ramparts. And I'd like to point out, you know, as I mentioned before, and we'll get to this a little bit more later, is the fact that some of these guys in the 54th Massachusetts are going to be settled in the Pittsburgh area in the post-war period, and actually belong to the city's prominent Grand Army of the Republic post in the city of Pittsburgh. You know, I want to point out too that almost half of the regiment were Pennsylvanians. Even though it is a Massachusetts regiment, you have a lot of these guys from Pennsylvania and New York State as well. So kind of going toward USCT recruitment, and you know, we discussed the United States colored troops and the fact that recruitment is really bolstered in the summer of 1863. On May 22nd, 1863 is when the Bureau of United States Colored Troops is actually founded. And they really start to up the recruitment. But this is actually an excerpt from the Pittsburgh Gazette on May 9th, 1863, so shortly beforehand. And they actually describe them trying to recruit African-American troops in the city of Pittsburgh at Lafayette Hall, which you see pictured here. I mentioned earlier, this is the corner of 4th and Wood Streets downtown. And this building is significant for a couple of reasons. Not only is it a recruiting post for African-American troops in Allegheny County, in the post-war period, this is going to be a meeting place for Grand Army veterans. So Union Army veterans have their reunions at this site. But also in the pre-war period, actually February 22nd, 1856, this is where the first Republican National Convention is going to be held, right in the city of Pittsburgh. And you have, you know, Republican delegates from all over the North coming to the site and essentially, you know, agreeing on one of the core issues that's at hand, and that's slavery, and doing away with it. And so, you know, it's kind of interesting that, you know, less than a decade after the Republican Party is being formed or coming together in Allegheny County, this same site is being used to recruit African-American troops, kind of furthering their purpose. And so, you know, as I mentioned, you have over 160 guys from Allegheny County who live in the county at the time of the Civil War. joining United States Colored Troop regiments. A lot of those guys are actually going to receive their training on the eastern side of the state at a place called Camp William Penn on the outskirts of Philadelphia. And so this is actually a photograph of Camp William Penn. This is the 26th USCT, around 1865, formed on parade. And really, excuse me, Camp William Penn is going to be a training site from June of 1863 onward to 1865. You're going to have 11 USCT regiments passing through Camp William Penn. Little over 8,000 of the guys who are training here are actually from Pennsylvania, but ultimately over 11,000 are going to pass through the gates of this camp. So it's the largest USCT training camp of its kind in the North. And I believe the recruitment poster on the right-hand side here was used for the event site on Facebook. And kind of to put this into context for you, the image on the right is actually kind of a facsimile of what's on the left-hand side, a photograph of USCT troops from Camp William Penn. It's believed that these guys are from the 25th USCT. And this photograph was taken around 1864 at Camp William Penn. And they thought it a good idea to kind of recreate this in a fashion that would inspire other African Americans to want to join the United States Colored Troops. And it is effective. One guy I kind of want to touch on, this is one of my favorite characters from Pittsburgh, is a guy named Alexander Kelly. Alexander Kelly is, I believe he's from Indiana County, Pennsylvania originally. And he's going to join the 6th USCT, which trained at Camp William Penn, which, they see action around the Petersburg area. They see action in the North Carolina, more specifically. And he's actually going to receive the Medal of Honor for action at the Battle of Newmarket Heights in Virginia. Most people think or when they hear Newmarket, they might think Newmarket in the Shenandoah Valley. This is more toward the Richmond area, where on September 29th, 1864, this is actually where African Americans are going to receive 14 Medals of Honor for their action, which is the most received in any action throughout the American Civil War. Kelly's actually going to, as cited, he sees the colors as they fell and saved the colors. And not too far away from him was another man named James Bronson, who was in the 5th USCT, who also receives the Medal of Honor. Both of these guys are actually going to move to Pittsburgh in the post-war period. Alexander Kelly is going to settle in the east end of Pittsburgh. He actually becomes a member of the Robert Gould Shaw Post 206, which we'll talk about in a bit. And he actually becomes in Allegheny City a night watchman toward the turn of the century. However, he's going to pass away in 1907, and today he's buried in St. Peter's Cemetery near the Mount Oliver neighborhood. For anyone who is a fan for those who are in Pittsburgh, those who are fans of Arsenal cider near the Allegheny Arsenal site, they actually have a cider named after Alexander Kelly, which is delicious. Kind of moving forward here, though, we talked about the Robert Gould Shaw Post 206 and the Grand Army of the Republic. And what does that look like for Black veterans in the post-war period? For anyone who's not familiar with the Grand Army of the Republic, or the GAR, it's a fraternal organization that's founded in 1866. Think of it as kind of the forefather of the American Legion or the VFW for Union veterans. And typically in the post-war period, outwardly, the GAR did not discriminate against Black veterans. And actually, I want to share with you real quick an account from 1872 from the state commander of Pennsylvania. He says, "We cared nothing for a man's nationality, race, politics, or religion. The fact that a man was ready at the call of his country in her hour of danger, when stout hearts quailed and brave men faltered is all the GAR seeks to know. And so, there are a few posts where you see integrated posts, but more often than not, you might see a GAR post that's completely constructed of African American veterans. This guy that I have pictured here is actually it's an unknown veteran. There's no name attached to him. However, he belonged to a post in Pittsburgh South Side, excuse me, the John Patterson Post 151, which was on East Carson Street. For anybody who's familiar with the South Side, that building is still there today. There's a skate shop on the first floor. However, if you kind of look up a little bit, you might see a large cast iron GAR in the front of the building. Another post that had some African American veterans was the Captain Thomas SB GAR Post 153, which you can still see today in Carnegie. Excuse me. I believe that they are open on Saturdays. It is a beautiful, refinished post, basically restored back to its original appearance, how it would have looked in the early 20th century. But one that I want to talk about in particular, and one that you'll hear Lisa talk about too, is the Robert Gould Shaw Post 206. And like I mentioned, it's an all African American post. It's named for Robert Gould Shaw, who commanded the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. It's a post that came about in 1881, and I believe it had, 11 members that founded the post, and it's going to be in existence until roughly 1930. This post, met in a few different places within Allegheny County. Among them, you had Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum in Oakland. One thing I want to note real quick is these guys actually took part in, larger events for the GAR, including the grand 28th annual encampment of Pittsburgh in 1894. This encampment consisted of at least roughly 50,000 veterans that showed up the week of September 11th, 1894. The photo I have on the right-hand side here was actually taken on Federal Street in Allegheny City, or Pittsburgh's north side, where you can see veterans marching down Federal Street into Allegheny City from the city of Pittsburgh, which would be up more toward the upper right-hand corner of the picture. But African Americans were not excluded from events like this. Something that I want to share with you real quick was, on I believe the second day of the encampment, veterans of the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, as well as a few other USCT regiments, congregated. They kind of had their own meeting. And in this meeting, they had formed kind of a, I guess you could say their own core group within the GAR. It was called the Colored Veterans Union of the Army and Navy of the United States. And one of their core goals during this 28th annual encampment was actually to endorse somebody who you may have heard of, Miss Ida B. Wells, who in the South was championing for anti-lynching laws. And these gentlemen completely threw their weight behind it. They completely supported her cause. And during their meeting, they actually had decided to kind of have everyone pitch in and start contributing financially to funding for detectives, and even funding for lawyers to get involved in these lynching cases, which were very widespread throughout the American South toward the end of the 19th century. And so, you see a lot of these African Americans heavily involved in not only these veterans affairs, but also within the community during the post-war period. And quite a few of these guys you're going to see buried at Allegheny Cemetery. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa and kind of let you talk a bit about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Rich. I appreciate it. Let me just go ahead and get my presentation up for everybody.
I'm trying to stop sharing, but it won't work.
Oh, that's okay. I think I got it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay. So again, thank you to Rich for all of your help with that, and just the information here. Hang on one second. We have somebody joining in still. So again, we're so incredibly honored to have, first of all, Civil War Pittsburgh here tonight to kind of share the background with us, but also just to be guardians at Allegheny Cemetery. It's a very large place. If any of you haven't been there, please at some point, stop by, come and visit us. At this point in time, currently, we have over 135,000 souls that are entrusted to us, which is something that we take very, very seriously. And we have people that are famous and well known, and we have people that are lesser known, and we have people that are unknown. And to us, all of those individuals are equal in terms of the amount of respect that they deserve from us and recognition. So that being said, a good portion of the USCT troops that were from Pittsburgh are with us at Allegheny. Back in 2010, we partnered with the Hallowed Grounds Project in order to identify a number of those individuals. And there was a researcher with Hallowed Grounds named Joe Beckton that was kind of very helpful in determining some of the names of these individuals. And Nancy Foley, who is with Allegheny Cemetery, also worked on that project in order to identify those individuals and just make sure that their names are remembered. So what we're presenting tonight is not a wholly definitive list. It's an ongoing project, and we continue to try to research this and kind of add to it as we go. So the regiments that are represented from the USCT are numerous in terms of individuals buried at Allegheny. Here is a list of 47 different regiments, and of these regiments listed, we have at least one individual from each, and oftentimes we have more than just the one. From these regiments, we have a number of different ranks that are represented, and those include things like sergeants, privates, corporals. We actually have 2 drummers, one that is listed as a musician, and a first sergeant. All right. So for each USCT regiment that is buried at Allegheny, and Rich can probably attest to this as well, each regiment would have had a flag that represented their particular union. And this was to kind of support morale, to rally the troops in battle, a number of different things with these. But the ones that I'm about to show you now are all representative, again, of a regiment that is actually buried at Allegheny. And beneath each one of those, I have a list of names, again, not all inclusive, that represents the individuals that we have that were part of each regiment. So we have a number of individuals from the 3rd Regiment, 24th Regiment, 26th Regiment, 27th Regiment, 45th Regiment, and then as Rich discussed, the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. As you'll notice looking at these flags, some of them are better representations than others, a little bit, of a sampling of them. The image that is shown for the Massachusetts 54th is significant. And again, Rich can probably speak to this a little bit later too if we have questions, but the gentleman holding that flag was Mr. Carney, and he's in the image that was shown on the background here that Rich showed earlier, who I believe was the first Black Medal of Honor recipient and received that for not letting that flag touch the ground during the attack at Fort Wagner. And so it's quite significant, this image of him with the flag representing the 54th, kind of represents the struggle that they incurred on that battlefield that day. So speaking of the 54th, we want to kind of just give you a little bit more background on one of the individuals from that regiment. The gentleman that you see pictured here is William Tecumseh Barks, and he went to apply for the 54th as soon as that opportunity was available. He was born in Bedford, PA, Cumberland County. Don't know if we have anybody online from that, but back in January of 1840. And these dates are as close as we can tell due to the age. Sometimes the newspapers had conflicting dates, but we tried to get these as close as we could. So as I mentioned, in 1863, Barks was part of that big recruitment push that we had in Pittsburgh. And as soon as he was able to, he did travel to Boston to try and join up with the Massachusetts 54th. He was officially enlisted as a private on March 21st at the age of 23, and then he mustered into service shortly thereafter. And shortly after he had enlisted is when the conflict took place that you see pictured in the background again here. And so he was part of the troops that went down to the south and stormed Fort Wagner in the attempt. They lost a number of individuals, most of their regiment. So of the 600 men from the 54th that took place on that, 270 were killed, captured, or wounded. They suffered mass casualties. There were individuals that were either killed, captured, or just never found. They were missing as part of the battle. And some of those that fell there remain there today, and that includes Captain Shaw. After the battle at Fort Wagner, William Barks was promoted to corporal in Company D of the Massachusetts 54th. And he continued his service with them for another 3 years and was mustered out of service in August of 1865. So here on the left, you can kind of see a depiction of his stone, which we have at Allegheny. Again, some of these stones were placed by the GAR, so they are older. You see he passes here in 1907. Again, a caveat on that, I did see 2 conflicting dates showing both 1906 and 1907 based in newspaper accounts. And so following his service with the Massachusetts 54th, Barks continued to have a very memorable life and career. One of the reasons that we're representing him tonight is because there was a lot of information that we were able to discern and find in newspaper accounts of him, which speaks both to, I think, the heroic nature of what these individuals did. But as I kind of go through this, please be conscious of the fact that this is representative of one particular individual out of many, and all of these gentlemen had very heroic stories to tell. Some of them we can just kind of find a little more easily all these years later. So after he was done in the service, he married Mary C. Palmer from Uniontown in 1872, and the couple went on to have 3 children, unfortunately, none of whom survived into adulthood. I did find an account that they had an adopted daughter together who did survive him and Mrs. Barks whenever she passed. So they remained married for 34 years until the time of his death. So one of the things that he was involved in after the war, similar to Mr. Kelly that was mentioned, was that he was appointed as an officer for the City of Pittsburgh Police Department. In doing so, he became only the 2nd Black officer for that force. And he worked out of the Center Avenue police station and patrolled the Heron Hill neighborhood, which is actually where his residence was. And so on July 1st of 1906, we have accounts of him retiring from the police force after completing 23 years on the job with them. And in addition to his service with the police force, we have numerous other accomplishments for Mr. Barks. He served as a Mason. He served as a Knights Templar. He was a member of the Bethlehem African American Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a treasurer for the National Afro-American League. And Rich mentioned the Shaw Post 206. Barks also followed to be a commander of that post. And one of the interesting things that I've found in terms of researching this was that that post had historians that would take accounts from the individuals that were members of the post. And so, I'm not sure how it is comparatively with some of the other post organizations, but the Shaw Post is fortunate in that they have a lot of those primary records are still available at Soldiers and Sailors, giving an accounting of, what these experiences were like for these individuals and, kind of how this affected them after the war and who they kept in touch with and who the members of the post were. As they were meeting at Soldiers and Sailors, and after the post sort of started to, unfortunately die out after a number of years, those materials were all inherited by Soldiers and Sailors where they remain today. So we also see, not surprisingly from somebody with this level of courage and fortitude, but Shaw served as a civil rights leader at a time when that was, almost unheard of. He was working with Robert Smith and S.A. Neal to kind of promote the Black vote in the 1870s and just to encourage, everybody to take advantage of the full rights and freedom that they were allotted. So finally at 8:43 on December 26th of 1907, around the age of 66 years old, Barks died at his home and was buried in section 33, lot 232, grave 221 at Allegheny Cemetery. And after such a remarkable life, it comes down to something rather simple where it just says the soldier rests. And I should only hope that after everything they accomplished, that he, along with all of the other comrades in his units and the numerous other regiments that we have there, were finally able to do that. So one of the footnotes of Mr. Barks' illustrious life is that he was a very accomplished poet and an author, and frequently he would have his works published in Alexander's Magazine, which was a prominent publication at the time. One of his best known pieces kind of takes a moment to reflect on the experiences that took place on the ramparts at Fort Wagner and as they were charging, and it sort of recounts the bravery and the heroism of all of the individuals that were there. And just, I think that Rich and I can retell this for you, and we can show you pictures like the one you see on the screen now that sort of show what was happening there. The poem is extremely long. I won't, get into all of it, but in reading it, I was very struck by the experience of these men and what it must have felt like in that moment to be there. So if you will permit me here to kind of read along, this is taken directly from Barks' poem, which is called The Charges of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment at Fort Wagner, dated July 18th of 1863. And of his experience, he wrote, "Once more we see that waiting line as the dull-faced moon arose to shine. In the dusky twilight, partial gloom, arose the outlines bold of the forts, so soon to be stormed by the men who once were slaves, and now risk their lives for freedom to save. Now ready are they to show the world that they were men in deed and worth. Look, the brave Shaw is pacing up and down, the lines thus formed to face the battery's frown. Listen, he in language clear and bold says to the men who were once bought and sold, this night you prove the manhood of your race, or sink as slaves in dire disgrace. Looking is the world, and noting too, if you as others shall stand in manhood true. Your rights as freemen you must defend. Life counts but little where right is questioned as to men. That you for truth and justice stand. Fight for that right that is equal for all men." So at that, I want to say thank you to all of you for attending. I want to extend my appreciation to both our president and board at Allegheny Cemetery for being supportive of our historical programs and recognizing the importance of all of the individuals that we have there. We have some more information that's available through our Facebook page. We kind of try to keep up with some of the historical posts, but we also have a mobile app that's available. If you would like to come down and take a tour and visit the cemetery, you're able to kind of walk through some of the footsteps of history that we have there. Rich, if you want to pass along any information that you may have on Civil War Pittsburgh, we have your Facebook page and post up here as well.
Yeah. So Civil War Pittsburgh is as our site is listed there in Facebook, but we also are on Instagram and Twitter as well. Especially with the pandemic that's been going on, a lot of the programming that we do, even in the before times, has been virtual, just because it's really convenient.
Right.
But we always like to kind of throw up different posts where you can kind of learn tidbits of information here and there about our local history. Something that I kind of want to mention real quick regarding the men who are buried in Allegheny Cemetery as well. And this is actually a direct quote from a guy named James Monroe Trotter, who was in the 55th Massachusetts. Not buried in Allegheny Cemetery or anything, but keep in mind what a lot of these guys are fighting for, as opposed to, say, white soldiers during the American Civil War, is a lot different. It's not necessarily, keeping the Union together, although some may have. But Trotter actually mentions that they're fighting for manhood and equality, as you heard mentioned in the recent poem. He even mentions fighting for manhood at the fight at Battery Wagner. These men are fighting for equality because in that time, as kind of indicated by the rejection of their enlistment in early 1861, they weren't seen as equal in the eye of the law. So when these guys are enlisting in these United States colored troop regiments, the 54th or 55th Massachusetts, etc., these guys are fighting for the opportunity to be seen as equals and for the opportunity at citizenship. And think of it as kind of a rebirth of the nation after 1865. So keep those things in mind. If you visit Allegheny Cemetery and walk around the graves of these African American veterans.
Absolutely. And if anybody has any questions, you can drop them in the chat. We are going to try to post a link to the chat here in case anybody joined late and would like to see the whole thing. Again, as Rich mentioned, with the pandemic going on right now, all of our in-person tours are kind of on hold. But again, I would encourage you to stop in our office. You can certainly visit our website and do the self-guided tours. But if you're aware of anybody that is here that we may not be aware of, or that you'd have some more information on, we would always welcome that. Again, it's impossible to do an all-inclusive list, but we continue that effort all these years later because it's the very least we can do for somebody that did so much for us. So let's see if we have any questions here. Okay, I think we are all set. If you think of any questions later on, you can, give us a call. You can ask for me directly at the cemetery. I will also drop my email address in the link that was posted on Facebook that many of you may have seen, just in case you want to follow up with any questions. Or you can reach out to Rich through Civil War Pittsburgh for follow-up on those.
I'm seeing some questions here. Somebody asked, will the program be available later? I'm not sure. Is this being recorded?
It is being recorded. We're going to try to share the link to it as soon as we get that done.
Okay.
Yeah, I know we had a couple people join late, so.
All right.
And let's see here. Okay, hang on one second. And Rich, I believe somebody asked a little bit earlier up the difference between the USCT and USCI, US colored troops and US colored infantry.
Yeah, that's the only difference, really.
Right.
Colored troops is more, I guess that could be inclusive of, cavalry or artillery as well.
And then we had somebody ask about the color of the uniforms, why they were wearing gray uniforms.
25th USCT wearing gray. That they would have been wearing, in the, I think you talking about the recruitment poster probably.
Right.
It's kind of derived from the photograph. They would have been wearing light blue greatcoats, so it wouldn't be quite gray, but very faded blue.
Right. Okay, very good. Anybody have any other questions that we can help with? All right. Well, I appreciate everybody joining us tonight. We hope to do more of these going forward, and then absolutely extend our appreciation to Rich and Civil War Pittsburgh for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Like I said, we'll post some information in the comments on the event, and thank you again for everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.